Today I'm talking about kennel stress. Kennel stress is real and it's inevitable to some extent. After all, you have your dog at home where they walk around the kitchen, living room, back garden, maybe go upstairs. They know the place, they know the routine, and suddenly you take them away from that and they're in an entirely new environment. And dogs are creatures of habit and they like their routines, and suddenly you've changed everything for them. So inevitably there's some degree of stress. So what I'm going to talk about today is 6 reasons for kennel stress. And once I've done that, I'm going to tell you about 6 ways that you can minimize kennel stress. Okay, so the first reason for kennel stress is the obvious one, which is that the new environment of kennels is unfamiliar. Like I said, dogs are very familiar with their own home. That's where they've always been, and they like it like that. And suddenly you take them away from that, and now they're in some sort of caged environment where they can't get out of this relatively small area. They probably do go out of it sometimes to exercise somewhere, but in that exercise area, it's also very new to them. So their mind has to do a lot of adjusting, getting used to this new environment, and that process of adjusting is stressful. The second thing that's different in kennels that causes stress is the close proximity to other pets. Now, again, at home, they'll be used maybe to one companion, maybe to a cat, whatever. Those companions are relatively consistent and same day in, day out, week in, week out, and they're used to that social environment. Suddenly, they're somewhere else where there are other dogs, not usually other cats, but other dogs especially, often in quite close proximity. There's a sight of them, there's a smell of them, and there's the sound of them. There's 3 big things for dogs. And again, they're not in control of their proximity to those other animals. So dogs feel stressed when they're not in control. So inevitably, that's it's going to cause them ongoing stress when they're kennelled. The third thing is stress relating to the change in diet. Again, you have your way of feeding your dog. You give them more or less similar type of diet, day in, day out, and at the same sort of times. And suddenly what's happening is they're getting completely new diet, one which they're not used to, and the feeding routine is different. They're used to you putting the food in the bowl, you saying a few particular words to them, and so on. And suddenly it's very, very different. And again, the difference causes stress. The next thing is the stress relating to the changed exercise routine. Again, at home, you probably have a habit of how you take your dog for walks. Maybe you go out first thing in the morning, maybe at lunchtime, maybe in the evening, whatever. You tend to do the same thing. Maybe it's different at weekends, but your dog learns even the 7-day routine. So suddenly they're in a boarding kennel, and yes, I'm sure they do have some sort of exercise regime there, but it's not what they're used to. And because it's not what they're used to, it's a little bit of a shock to their system, and that's what we call stress. And the last thing, well, that's 2 things actually, I'm down to 4. The 5th one is a change in sleeping pattern, because you will, again, most people have a daily routine for themselves where they get up at a particular time and they go to bed at a particular time, and your dog fits in with that generally. So your dog might get up at 7 in the morning, go for a walk with you, might have a snooze in the daytime, and then walk in the evening, and then at bedtime, when you go to bed maybe at 10 or 11, the dog goes to bed as well, and that's their home routine. In a boarding kennel, their routine is not controlled by them again. It's controlled by the boarding kennel people, and what they will do is they'll have their own way of doing things. So they may wake the dogs up at 7, or it might be 8, or it might be earlier, it might be 6, and it tends to be activity most of the day at some level, and then in the evening, again, they'll have a different time of going to bed and a different kind of routine. Your dog is not going to view you coming up to them and saying, "All right, little one, here's your bedtime treat, and nighty-night." That's not going to happen, okay? So, very different sleeping routine. And the 6th and final thing I think that really needs to be mentioned is that your dogs will miss you when they're in boarding kennels. They may have very caring, attentive kennel owners or kennel hands looking after them, but that's not you. And unfortunately, if you're apart from your pet and if they're close to you, they are going to miss you. The consequence of all of this kennel stress, often it's no big deal. Animals can cope with stress to some extent. But what a lot of people find is that when they pick their dogs up from boarding kennels, the dogs are really quite flat, almost depressed for a few days afterwards. And that often is a consequence of the stress that they've been through. So what can you do to minimise kennel stress? given that to some extent it is inevitable. First thing you can do is you can keep the routine for them as similar as possible to your home routine. So in other words, you can have a conversation with the kennel owners and say, listen, I've written down his daily routine here. This is when he gets up in the morning, this is when he gets exercise, this is when he's fed. And if they can kind of listen to you and take action to try to keep that similar as possible, then that's going to make the stay in the kennels easier. And the other thing that you can do is you can organise a pre-boarding visit. So your dog might go to the boarding kennels just for one day or even for 2 days. Like it might be for a weekend, for example. If you're going away, you can say, well, on this occasion we'll leave our dog into the boarding kennels rather than asking friends to look after them or whatever. And that way, your dog can have a small dose of an experience of being in a boarding kennel, and that will help them mentally get ready for it, so that when they go in for a longer time, they're less stressed by it. The third thing you can do is, just as I said, you try not to change their routine, you can try not to change their diet. And you can do that very simply by, if you feed your dog on a bag of dried food, you can take the dried food to the boarding kennel and say, instead of the stuff that you normally use, would you mind feeding our dog on the food that we normally feed? And here it is. People sometimes do that and then say, well, can we have a discount because using our food instead of your food? I don't think that would necessarily be the case. Because a business is kind of more complicated having to use somebody else's food, and there's a little hassle factor involved in doing that. But certainly, if you do it, your dog will probably appreciate that you're not upsetting their diet in any way. The next thing you can do is you can make sure that they have an exercise routine that is as close as possible to what they get at home, and possibly even a bit more exercise. That means talking to the boarding kennel again about exactly what exercise they give their dogs, and trying to persuade them to give your own dog a particular amount and type of exercise. And if you can do that, your dog's experience in kennels will be much, much better. And the next thing you can do is talk to them also, same way as you talked about exercise, you can talk to them about sleeping, about what the sleeping schedule is, and you can let them know when your dog goes to bed and gets up, and you can see if they can maybe adjust things a little bit to give your dog a similar sleeping routine to the home routine. The sixth and final thing to say about minimising stress in kennels is that you can buy a type of pheromones. It's called Adaptil, and it's pheromones which they're like scent which doesn't smell. It stimulates the sensors in the nasal cavity, and it sends messages to the brain. And there's Adaptil is a pheromone which is basically the same secretion that's produced by a bitch's mammary glands for puppies, and it gives puppies a sense of being relaxed and comforted. So if you put a collar that's infiltrated with pheromones around your dog's neck, that will give your dog that same sense of being comforted and reassured. And so they've done studies that show that dogs wearing Adaptil collars are less stressed during times like visits to kennels. So that's like an extra thing you can get, and you can ask your vet about that. So there you go, 6 causes of stress and 6 things you can do about it. Of course, you could also take a use of a pet sitting facility like How's My Dog? And that way your dog doesn't even need to go into boarding kennels in the first place. So that is another option.